I introduce the speaker, who is Wim Verbeke. Wim is a professor of agri-food marketing and consumer behavior at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the Ghent University in Belgium. And of course, he's very, let's say, important researcher about citizen and consumers' perceptions and acceptance of, in particular, novel application in the agri-food chain. His presentation today is about consumers' perception of alternative proteins, risk-benefit considerations. Wim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Davide. Welcome also on my behalf to all the attendees to this 2023 Parma Summer School. I'm also very glad to be part of this event and to share with you some insights from 3 case studies where alternative proteins were on the agenda, and where also risk-benefit considerations indeed played a role in shaping consumer interest, consumer rejection or acceptance of these foods or food concepts. The 3 case studies, they fit nicely in the program. You have already yesterday discussed insects, cell cultured meat and also microalgae. And the 3 case studies exactly link up with this. And in one of the case studies, we are also explicitly going to look at the impact of food neophobia on consumer willingness to adopt these kind of new food products or less familiar food products. So the first case study is dealing with consumer willingness to adopt insects. The second one is focusing on barriers and motives shaping consumer willingness to eat cultured meat. And the third one is focusing on consumer perception and interest in foods with microalgae proteins. Let's have a look at case 1. So here in this study, we collected data in Belgium. So the sample is a national sample only. The size of this sample is quite similar as what we have seen for a typical sample size of EFSA flash poll surveys. So we had around 400 participants. Most of them were meat consumers. The data were collected 10 years ago, so it's not very recent. We were focusing here on people who were responsible for food purchasing, who were the main responsible for food purchasing in the household. That explains the bias with respect to gender. The mean age of the sample was quite representative or mirroring the mean age in the population that we were focusing on. 1/4 of these participants ate meat on a daily basis. 2/3 ate meat several times a week. So a lot of those participants were at that time already flexitarians to some extent, depending on how we define it. About 1/5 were planning to reduce their meat consumption, and 3/4 had heard about the eating of insects. So when we look at our main variable of interest here, which was willingness to adopt insects, on the left-hand side you see the result from this consumer sample. We were only focusing in this analysis on the meat consumers, and you see that in the green parts here, about 20% indicated that they would rather or definitely be willing to adopt insects in their diet. On the other hand, 1/3 said definitely not or rather not. And on the right-hand side, the other pie chart here is a sample of my own students the year after, 2014, where I asked the same question to my students. So this is a much younger population group, 50-50 male-female. It's a classroom setting. These are students bioscience engineering at Ghent University. And you see quite a different picture, that among this sample of younger people, who were also following some education in natural sciences with a strong focus on food and agriculture. That about 1/3 of them indicated that they would rather or definitely be willing to try to adopt insects in their diet. Just to flag this, the following analysis they are focusing on the sample of the left-hand pie chart, so the 368 consumers representative for the Flemish population in Belgium. The type of modeling we used here in this study was a binary logistic regression modeling, a probit model, where we try to model the willingness to adopt insects as a probability, and that probability was modeled as being determined by personal characteristics like gender, age, education, also attitudinal and behavioral variables like familiarity with the eating of insects, but also food neophobia, as well as food technology neophobia, consumers' interest in health when they make food choices, their interest in convenience, their interest in the environment, their focus on meat taste, their belief that meat is nutritious, and also their intention to reduce meat consumption. So all those variables were included in the model, and that yielded logistic regression coefficient estimates, which were in the end also used to calculate probabilities, to simulate probabilities among different profiles of consumers. So this was the main result table of the analysis, where two variables were not significant, namely education and interest in health when making food choices. They were not significant in shaping the willingness to adopt insects. The most interesting here is the last column indicated in green, which contains the odds ratios from the analysis, and the interpretation of those odds ratios is summarized on the next slide. So what those odds ratios actually tell us is that the likelihood of adopting insects as an alternative to meat is double as large among men compared to women. Second, it decreases with 27% per 10 years age increase, so there is a significant age effect as well. It is 4.5 times bigger among people who plan to reduce their meat consumption. It's 2.6 times bigger among people who have heard about the eating of insects. It increases with 75% per unit importance attached to convenience. So apparently there is a belief among consumers that eating insects is convenient, perhaps more convenient than baking a steak, for example. It also increases with 71% per unit importance attached to the environmental impact of food choice. So it is perceived clearly also as fitting with an environmentally friendly food choice. And then importantly, it decreases with 84% per unit increase on the scale of food neophobia. Here in this case, we used a 5-point scale, not a 7-point scale, as we have seen in the previous presentation. And it also decreases 55% per unit on the scale of food technology neophobia. And so as people believe that more technology is involved and that they are concerned about the involvement of technology, also their willingness to adopt insects decreases. Finally, it also decreases with about 60% per unit importance attached to the taste of meat and the conviction that meat is nutritious and healthy. And so people who have a very strong and positive perception about meat are much less likely to adopt an alternative, in this case, insects. Finally, what we did here in the study is we used the estimates from the binary logistic regression model to simulate probabilities of willingness to adopt insects for different types of consumers. And what you see on this graph here is a profile for a female, 50 years of age, a meat lover, who is strongly attached to the taste of meat and also convinced about the healthiness of meat. That's the profile in red, versus then the profile in green, which is the profile of a male, 30 years of age, who pays a lot of attention to the environmental impact of food choice and who's also in search for alternatives to meat. These two profiles are shown here across the range of food neophobia on the horizontal axis, which ranges here from 1 to 5. And those two profiles are quite extreme in the sense that they give us an image of almost the entire range in which we can expect that probability to vary. Obviously, what we see is that with extremely high levels of food neophobia, these two types of consumers, they behave very similarly. They are clearly not interested in adopting insects as part of their daily diet. With a very low level of food neophobia on the left-hand side of the graph, we see that we have quite a high probability for this male profile. We have a rather low probability for this female profile. So this is an interesting way of dealing with results from a binary logistic regression. As we have 0, 1 variable that we try to model, we can also use the outcomes here in this type of probability simulation exercise. Also in the next case, I'm going to show you some of this type of results. So case 2 is looking at cultured meat. It's actually a study that was more recently published, but we were using exactly the same data set as with the insect study that I showed just before. So it's the same consumer sample, 404 consumers, but in the same study we also had a focus, we had a part that was looking explicitly at cultured meat. Obviously at that time extremely hypothetical, and still today mostly hypothetical. So this was really like the far future at that time for consumers. And first we were asking them to what extent they believe cultured meat would be sustainable, nutritious, and so on. And you see that the most favorable perception was related to sustainability, nutritious, ethical also, and that's still on the higher end of this graph. Consumers had much more reserves about the naturalness, where they perceived this as clearly not natural. 50% was indicating this, and they were also concerned that this would be a very expensive product, which indeed is the case, as in the few markets on our globe where it is available at the moment. And they also perceive it very much as not real. This pie chart indicates, in a similar vein as with the insects, the share of people who would be definitely interested, rather interested. And together we see there about 22% who indicates that they would be willing to consider eating cultured meat as an alternative to conventional meat. We also asked those participants why they would consider the eating of cultured meat, and also why they would not consider eating cultured meat. So and this was then translated into motives and barriers. So with respect to motives, reduced animal suffering was the main driver. Providing a solution to feeding the world was also perceived as a driver, and being better for the environment. Out of curiosity, and it is healthier, they were clearly lower ranked in terms of possible drivers, possible motives to try cultured meat. On the other side, why would consumers not consider eating cultured meat? Well, mainly because they perceive it is not natural, they do not consider it real meat, and they do not trust it. What we did next was a similar type of analysis as with the insect study. And so we also tried to model the willingness to to adopt cultured meat through binary logistic regression. The results are indicated here. Again, we have in the green column there the odds ratios. We see again a gender effect, we see an age effect. We also see that this product is not really appealing to vegetarian consumers because vegetarian consumers still associate it with being animal-based. And we also see a very interesting difference there between the impact of perceived barriers versus motives. And that's something we are going to further explore in the next slide. So here we have two slides, two graphs with simulated probabilities. On the left-hand side, depending on the strength of motives, and on the right-hand side, depending on the strength of perceived barriers. So obviously, as people perceive those motives to be stronger, you see that this probability increases. And on the other side, as they have a stronger barrier perception, the probability decreases. And again, we see the gender effect indicated here in this graph. What is most interesting here from this study is that those odds ratios, they told us actually that the perceived barriers emerged as being twice as powerful compared to motives in shaping consumers' willingness to eat cultured meat. So we obtain a ratio of 2 to 1, simply based on the comparison of the odds ratios in those for those two variables. The means that are indicated there, so the mean of 3.26, that is the mean perception score for motives. So that means on average that probability of being willing to accept cultured meat is quite low, both among males and females. In the right-hand side, the mean perceived barrier score, 3.58 on that sample, well, indicates something very similar. So we are obtaining here a probability of less than 10%. Finally, my last case that I would like to share with you is a more recent study with a focus on microalgae proteins. This study was part of the Horizon 2020 project ProFuture that is running to an end in the next couple of months. And we have some papers in the pipeline related to that study. So here the focus was on microalgae proteins in different types of carrier foods. We had a survey in 5 European countries, total sample size around 3,000 in 2021. This graph gives you an image of the extent to what people are familiar with foods containing microalgae proteins. The blue indicates, yes, I have heard of these products and I already tasted them, which was highest in Spain, followed by Italy, lowest in Hungary. I have heard of such products but never tasted them. That's the orange bar. And the majority of consumers indicated, no, I've never heard of these products. And that was especially the case in the Netherlands and Hungary. Just to give you a little bit of insight about consumers' familiarity with microalgae protein foods in this study sample. We also assessed their perceptions of foods with microalgae proteins as a general concept. And this graph indicates us that consumers clearly perceive this type of food as being innovative, sustainable, healthy, and we can also say natural as well as expensive to some extent on the right-hand side. On the other hand, there was, they did also not really perceive it as being harmful for human health. They did also, the majority did not perceive these foods as being unsafe or likely to cause food allergies. But to the lower side, we see highly processed there, and quite a substantial number of consumers indeed indicated that they perceive these foods with microalgae proteins as being highly processed. And that's an issue of some concern at least, and something to watch out for in my opinion, for the next couple of years because of that ultra high process status of a lot of these alternative protein foods. Finally, what I would like to share here is the result of a segmentation analysis. We identified 4 consumer segments based on their willingness to try foods with microalgae proteins. That was one dimension of the segmentation. And the second dimension was their attribute perceptions of foods with microalgae proteins. We named those segments from uninterested over undecided, indecisive, cautiously waiting. I think more recently we changed that name of the segment into cautiously curious or something. Yeah. And finally, enthusiast. Now, what is most interesting at this stage is that we clearly see increasing levels of food neophobia again and food technology neophobia as we move from the right to the left segment. So the uninterested, they have the strongest, the highest level of food neophobia as well as food tech neophobia. Versus on the other side, on the right-hand side, as we move from left to right, we see an increasing general health interest, also an increasing environmental concern, increasing positive perceptions, especially nutrient-related perceptions concerning foods with microalgae proteins, and also a stronger interest in related information. So that study also indicates that, of course, the consumer does not exist and that we need to be careful in generalizing, and it matters really to look at diversity among that consumer group. Finally, let me draw some conclusions based on these 3 case studies that we have shown. Clearly, consumer acceptance of innovative food products cannot be taken for granted. Consumer research can shed light on barriers, motives, perceived risks and benefits, and also on the extent to what they are driving acceptance, rejection, and consumer interest. We know obviously that a multitude of personal, product-related, as well as environmental factors shape consumer acceptance. So there is a plethora of influences, too much actually, all to be studied in one go. Food neophobia as well as food tech neophobia often emerge as determinants of acceptance, in line with what we have seen in the previous presentations. Consumers are obviously not all alike. Segments matter. Segmentation studies can help us a lot to gain better insights in the behavior of markets. And finally, I did not stress that explicitly in the presentation, but clearly issues pertain to perceived naturalness when we are talking about alternative proteins or food with alternative proteins, and also their ultra-high processing status, which is something that is heavily debated at the moment, at least within the scientific community, not so much yet at consumer level, but that's something to watch out for in the years to come. So thanks a lot for your attention. I welcome your questions as part of the Q&A session, and I give the floor back to our chair, Davide.